Again, good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank everyone for taking the time out to be here with us today. My name is Huynh. I'm the Asian Real Estate Association of America, Silicon Valley Chapter President. You know, it's absolute honor for me here to present you the event with the title, Being Asian in America, My Story, Your Inspiration. The speaker series actually was inspired by our 10-year anniversary video. The idea was created to have a speaker series for the community where we highlight a prominent Asian individual in the local community to give his or her personal story. The story that may give light to some trials and tribulations that individual has faced as an Asian American, but the true takeaway is how that individual dealt with all the obstacles and fought their way to outcome be the person they are the way today. People say, what doesn't break you make you stronger. At AREAA, we want these stories to encourage and inspire us as we move forward, not only as an individual, but as a community overall. This is a very special event. You guys are here today because someone personally invited me to come out today. So, it was special. I want to especially thank AREAA Foundation for allowing AREAA Silicon Valley to host this event. And thank you, Nick Pham, Michelle Lin. Not only you guys sponsor the event, but you work so hard on the final details. I want to thank you, my Vice President, Asuka Yubei, my board directors, my committee members. You guys worked so hard to put this event together in less than 2 weeks' notice, so I appreciate it. There's a few special guests in the house with us tonight, so I'm going to go through the list real quick. I want to recognize Alan Jing, our chapter president from SF Peninsula. Mr. Alan Okamoto, our AREAA Foundation father. Amy Tong, AREAA Foundation board member. Amy Tong. Colin Chong is women chairwoman, national chairwoman. Please stand up. David Toma, Silva, president. Are you in? Okay. David probably went to the old address. Alan Amusan's Great East Bay chapter president. Thank you, Alan. We have Ginger Lai from ACI organization. John Tripp from Silva, national NER director. We have Mr. John Wong, one of AREAA founder. Kenson Chung, our Council District 4 member. He probably went to the wrong address as well. We have Mr. Carl Lee, SCORE past president. We have Mimi Wang, Women Council Realtor president. Nick Pham, our AREAA SV past president. Paul Stewart, the SCEPCAR Government Affairs Director. We have Pham No, our Deputy Chief of San Jose. I saw Pham earlier. Richard Miller, our FARIPA 2010 past president. Tess Cassini, our FARIPA past president. And Johnny Kim is Chief of Staff of Sean Conley office.
Actually, a council member.
Okay, sorry. We have Mr. Alan Okamoto, one of our founding father of AREAA, chairman of AREAA Foundation, and he also wears many different hats in his local community. And of course, we're here for our special guest today is Mr. Norman Mineta. Today's speaker series will have the privilege to learn Norman's personal story and his journey to the Hall of Congress. So, with that,
you know, I'm so curious to find out how you feel about having an airport named after you. And I wanted to find out, do they make you go through security?
Absolutely. I always tell people, isn't that strange? My parents named me after an airport. I go through security, I have to be wanded and everything else. I was coming through the LA airport one day, and my wife had already completed coming through security, and I was being wanded, and with my arms outstretched, And there was a little 5-year-old, 7-year-old boy saying to the father, "Daddy, what did that man do?" And my wife said, "He invented the system." Remember, after 9/11, we had to set up a new security regimen. So that came to be TSA, Transportation Security Administration. But in setting it up, we went from 0 employees on November 17th of 2001 to 67,000 employees on November 17th, 2002. It was the largest mobilization since World War II of a new agency within the federal government. And, you know, as I think back to what we were doing, we didn't know how to line people up at the airport. So I called Disney. I said, "Hey, can you help me line people up at the airport?" So they said, "Sure." They sent 3 people to DC from Orlando. And within a week, the team leader said, "You know, Mr. Secretary, once you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. Because every airport is different. You can't take a cookie-cutter approach and have it apply at DFW, San Francisco, O'Hare, JFK, Atlanta, wherever. Every airport is different." And they ended up sending us 17 people on their dime to help us design the system at all the airports. The other part of it was that we wanted to make sure that the employees were doing their job properly. So we brought in Marriott to do the training on the employees. And one of the things I also did, there was a fellow by the name of Winston Chu here in San Jose. He had a master's from National University in Taiwan. Then he came to Rice, got another master's and a PhD. Eventually came to San Jose to work for IBM. And then by 1984, he hit the glass ceiling. He said, "Oh, forget it, I'm leaving." So he left IBM, set up a company called Selectron. And in 6 years, he won the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And then that was 1991. 1997, at the time in 77, he was a $400 million company. He won it again in 1997. And at that point, he was a $2.8 billion company. So I called him up and I said, "Winston, you must have done something correctly. So I need whoever's doing your quality assurance to come and help us out as we grow this new agency." So Dr. Tom Kennedy came out to DC, spent about 6-7 months on Selectron's dime as we were growing TSA. So it comes from a combination of not only being a Berkeley graduate. How many Berkeley graduates? Hey, go Bears. But having been in the Army and on 9/11, I was having breakfast with the Deputy Prime Minister of Belgium, who was also the Minister of Transportation, and Jane Darby, who's the head of the Federal Aviation Administration. And my chief of staff came in, said, "May I see you?" So I excused myself, went into the office. And at the other end of the office was a TV council, obviously the World Trade Center. Black smoke coming out. I said, "What's that?" He said, "We don't know. We've heard general aviation into the building. We've heard commercial aviation into the building. We've heard the possibility of an internal explosion within the building." So I listened to all the TV and did some channel surfing. So then I said, "Hey, I'm going to go back into the breakfast room." So I went back in and told Mrs. Durant and Jane Darby what I had just seen on TV. And so John came back in and said, "May I see you?" So I excused myself, came into the office. He said it was an American Airlines it went into the building. So I came up to my TV set, I'm sitting there watching it. And as I'm watching it, all of a sudden this gray thing comes across the screen. And then it disappears. And then from the left-hand side of the screen, this white, yellow, orangey, black, billowy cloud. And I said, holy cow, what was all that about? Or words to that effect. And so that really got my attention, because I knew by the colors that was a United Airlines plane. So I said, John, I've got to get back in. So I went back in. I said, I don't know what's happening in New York, but it's something I'm going to end up having to deal with. And Jane, you've got to get back to the operations center at FAA. So by the time I got back into the office, the White House called saying, get over here right away. So I grabbed some stuff, put it in my briefcase, and went to the White House. As we were driving into the White House, West Executive Drive, people were running out of the old executive office building. They were running out of the White House. And I said to my driver and security guy, is there something wrong with this picture? We're driving in, everyone else is running away. So I went into the White House and the officer said, you've got to be briefed by Dick Scalar in the Situation Room. So I went in there and he told me not much more than what I had already heard on television. Then he said, you've got to be at the PI. So what's the PI? That's the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. It's a bunker way under the White House. And so I said, I have no idea where it is. And there was a Secret Service agent standing there. He says, I'll take you. So we went down to the PI. Probably got there about 9:20. And so there's a big, long conference table, 30 feet, 40 feet long, about 12 feet, 15 feet wide. Chairs all the way around the conference table. And between each of the chairs, there's a phone. So one phone here I set up with my office, and this one I set up to the operations center, the FAA, and said, keep the line open, don't hang up. So from that point on, I stayed there in that same seat till about 5 o'clock that afternoon. And a military officer came in and said to the vice president, who was sitting directly across from me, there's a plane heading towards DC. So I'm on the phone with Monty Belcher, the number 2 guy at FAA. I said, Monty, what do you have on radar of a plane coming towards DC? He said, well, we're tracking this target. The transponder has been turned off. And on my credenza behind my desk, I had a TV monitor outline of the 48 states, Alaska, Hawaii. And there were dots all over. I took my mouse, put it on one of the dots, then a flag comes up. And it'll say something like, UA 123, United Airlines, flight 123. Then it would say B752, Boeing 757-200 series. Then it would say PDX, and a number of navigation points, and then ORD. So I knew the plane took off from Portland. This is the navigation points it was using to get to O'Hare, Chicago. Then on the second line, it would show the compass direction of the airplane, the ground speed of the airplane, how much fuel do they have on the aircraft, and a number of other things. But that transponder had been turned off, so they had no idea who that airplane was. And all they were doing was tracking that little white dot on the radar screen as it made the 11-second sweep by radar. So every so often I'd say, Monty, where is that plane? And it's hard to look at the radar set and then relate it to a point on the ground. He said, well, it's probably somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania. Every so often I'd say, where is it now? And he'd say, well, it's north of Boston. Where is it now? It's near Roslyn. Where is it now? Oh, somewhere between Roslyn and National Airport. Where is it now? Probably somewhere between Pentagon City and National Airport. Where is it now? Oops. Oops what? We just lost the bogey. We just lost the target. Where'd you lose it? Somewhere between Pentagon City and National Airport. As we were on the phone, someone broke into the line and said, Mr. Secretary, we just got a call from an Arlington County police officer who saw an American Airlines go into the Pentagon. And at that point, I said to Monty, Monty, that's the third commercial aircraft being used as a missile. And we don't know what's going on. In the military, they have something called stand down, where they bring everything forward and try to figure out what's going on and try to extricate themselves from the problem they have. So I said, we're going to have to do our own stand down. So I said, let's bring all the airplanes down. And Monty was the air traffic controller at the base level, and now was the number 2 at the Federal Aviation Administration. He said, Mr. Secretary, we'll bring them all down per pilot discretion. Pilot to the captain of the ship. And I said, Monty, screw pilot discretion. I want all the planes down. Because I didn't want to pilot over Albuquerque or Phoenix, figuring, well, I'll just fly on to LA. I'll be able to sleep in my own bed tonight. So I want all the airplanes down. So at that point, we had 4,638 airplanes in the air. And from the time we said, bring them all down, it was 2 hours and 20 minutes that all those planes were down on the ground safely, without incident. About 9:45 in the morning, I called the Minister of Transport of Canada, David Colonette. I said, David, I need your help. He said, well, we're watching television as to what's going on down there. What is it you need? I said, I've got planes coming in from Europe, planes from Asia that are now beyond the halfway point. Because the others that were not beyond the halfway point were told to go back to where they took off. So we have a bunch of planes coming in. I said, I don't want to take them. Can you take them in Canada? Well, Canada has a private air traffic control system. So he said, well, let me put you on hold and I'll get right back. So I was on hold for less than 2 minutes and David got on the phone. He said, we'll take them all. End of September, he came down and brought a picture with him of the plane, the airport in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This little town has probably a population of about 5,000 people. About 5 o'clock that day, that population had gone to 12,000. They don't have hotels, no motels, so they had to open up church social halls, schools, put in cots, and some people even had people staying in their own homes. And but the picture that he brought with him showed 53 wide-body and single-aisle planes, wingtip to wingtip, nose to tail, all lined up at that little airport in Halifax. Now, on the 5th anniversary of 9/11 in 2006, I was up there to thank everybody for what they did 5 years ago. And I met a couple. He was from London, she was from Houston, and they were celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary because they had met 9/11, 2001 in Halifax.
So interviewing Norm is the easiest job in the world. I just say good afternoon and he speaks for a half an hour. That's really a story. I was going to ask him that story about 9/11 later, but he covered it so dramatically that I can't imagine having control of 4,000 something airplanes and immediately having them grounded. It's just a dramatic story. And he's really an American hero just for being the Secretary of Transportation during that period of time. And I understand that you're a native of San Jose. So can you tell us a little bit about Silicon Valley before it was Silicon Valley?
Well, one of the seminal moments in my life is when I chose very carefully the family that I was born into. Great father, great mother, both immigrants from Japan. 3 older sisters, an older brother, and me, the youngest of the 5 children. Raised here in Japantown, here in San Jose. And it was an ordinary life before World War II. And on December 7th, we came home from church, and the radio was talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor. People were calling the house, wondering what's the impact on all of us of what's happening at Pearl Harbor. And we had a next door neighbor who was the executive secretary of the Japanese Association, which was a social organization. We had a hedge between our home, and down below we had a cutout for Gordon or Joyce, Hirano, or I would be able to go back and forth through that hedge cut. And Joyce came running in our house about 1:30, running through the house yelling, "Police are taking Papa away, police are taking Papa away." So my dad ran out the front door to go next door, but Mr. Hirano was already gone. No one knew who came to pick him up, where he was. And so my dad called the city manager, said, "What's going on?" He said, "I don't know, but why don't you call the chief of police?" So he called the chief of police, Black. He said, "Mr. Mineta, I don't know anything about it, but why don't you call Sheriff Bill Emick?" So he called Sheriff Emick, and Sheriff Emick said, "Well, I know what's going on, but it's not my operation, it's the FBI. And I'll have the FBI agent call you." Well, about 4 o'clock that afternoon, the FBI agent came to the house to explain to my dad what was going on. And he said, "We're picking up people who are sympathetic to the government of Japan and people who are closely related to things Japanese and community leaders." Well, my dad thought, "I'm a community leader, why aren't they arresting me?" But luckily they didn't. And in fact, as a result of that visit, he and my mother packed a suitcase for him just in case they came back. But they never did. But it was really an ordinary life growing up in San Jose before the war. And then after Pearl Harbor, with all this tension about Japan, and people couldn't make the distinction between those pilots who were in those airplanes and people who looked like them, who lived in Washington, Oregon, California. And there was this drumbeat going on about getting the Japanese out of the West Coast. And there was a commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command who figured if they can attack Hawaii, they can attack the West Coast. And what do I do with 120,000 people? And on February 17th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And that delegated to General DeWitt, the commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command, the ability to evacuate persons. Didn't say Germans, didn't say Italians, didn't say Japanese, just said persons. Well, General DeWitt then took it upon himself, again, thinking about the attack, Pearl Harbor, what am I going to do with 120,000 people, Japanese ancestry? So he commandeered racetracks, county fairgrounds. And using Executive Order 9066, we were all forcibly removed from our homes into the racetracks and county fairgrounds because they had built-in living quarters, namely the horse stables. So here, all of a sudden, 120,000 people forcibly removed from their homes. And all they could take was what they could carry. And one of my saddest moments then was I had to give away my dog. And he was a terrier. I loved peanut butter. So the dog's name was Skippy. And I had to give Skippy away. But that was a bad day in Black Rock. So on May 29th, 1942, is when we were being evacuated from San Jose. And in order to notify all of us, these big placards went up. It said, "Attention, all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien." As a 10-year-old kid, I read that sign going, who's a non-alien of the United States? It's a citizen. And my own government wasn't willing to acknowledge us as citizens. We were non-aliens of the United States of America. Now, I don't know when the last time was that you stood up, beat your chest, and said, "I am a proud non-alien of the United States of America." And that's why I cherish the word citizen, because my own government wasn't willing to use that word in describing me and all of us who were of Japanese ancestry, born in the United States. So we were evacuated on May 29, 1942. I was wearing my Cub Scout uniform, baseball glove, baseball bat. And as I got on the train, the MPs confiscated my bat because it could be used as a lethal weapon. So I went running and crying to my father, saying, "The MPs took my bat away." He said, "That's all right, we'll get another bat sometime." So fast forward to 1991. I had written the legislation called Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, ISTEA. It came to be known as ICE-T. And it was the first rewrite of the National Defense Highway Act that President Eisenhower signed in 1956. And it became landmark legislation. So I was honored by the American Society of Civil Engineers by being awarded the title of Fellow of the American Society of Civil Engineers. And a guy in LA read about my story in the AAC magazine, including my losing the bat. And he said, "I want you to have a bat for my collection." So I opened this long box, and it said, "Louisville Slugger," signed by Hank Aaron, U.S. Home Run King, and Sada Haruo, the Home Run King of Japan. I go, wow, and I write this letter profusely, thanking this person for this wonderful gift. A reporter from the San Jose Mercury News heard about the bat, wrote a story about it. Being an enterprising reporter, he went to a sports store, found out the bat was worth $1,500. But the gift limitation for a member of Congress was $250. So I had to pack up the bat and send it back to this guy, saying I can't accept it, and explaining why. And I sent a copy of that letter to the reporter, and I wrote on there, "Damn government's taking my bat again." 1995, I retired from Congress after 21 years, and he wrote a letter saying, "Congratulations on your retirement. That law doesn't apply to you anymore. Here's the bat."
You know, the incarceration of the Japanese Americans, I emphasize the term Americans, American citizens in the concentration camps during World War II. It was an example of racial profiling in its first form. I wonder if you could comment on the racial profiling today of the Muslims and the Arab Americans in the United States.
Well, that morning on 9/11, I was sitting in the PIOC. I transferred 3 people from ACS, Aviation Civil Security of the Federal Aviation Administration, said, "Come on over to the office and work with my chief of staff and the deputy secretary set up the new regimen under which security would be done. And because by the afternoon, all the CEOs of the airlines were calling saying, hey, when do we get back into the air? And I said, not until we get our security regimen in place. Right at the top of that list was no racial profiling. And on Thursday, September 13th, we were having a cabinet meeting with the House and Senate, Republican and Democratic leadership. Towards the end of that meeting, Congressman David Bonnier from Michigan said, Mr. President, we have a very large population of Arab Americans, Muslims in Michigan. And they're concerned about all the rhetoric that's going on about banning Middle Easterners, Muslims flying, even some talk about rounding them up. And we're concerned about all this rhetoric in the print and the electronic media. President Bush says, David, you're absolutely correct. We're equally concerned about all the rhetoric, and we don't want to have happen today what happened to Norm in 1942. On that following Monday, September 17th, he had a very large meeting with Arab Americans and Muslims at the Islamic Studies Center in Washington, D.C. He asked me to go with him to that meeting. And he said to them, we know who did it last Tuesday. They weren't loyal Arab Americans. They weren't faithful followers of Islam. They were terrorists, and we're going to go after them. Then towards the end of September, there was a shooting, and the person was killed in Arizona. And the person owned a gas station with one of these little mini marts. And when they apprehended the killer, they asked him, why did you kill this guy? And the guy answered, because he looked like the enemy. He was a Sikh. He had a turban, facial hair, leg bindings, and he said he looked like the enemy. And so he killed him. So later in October, President Bush then had a very large meeting of South Asian Indian Americans and Sikhs at the White House. And he said, we're going to go after every hate crime that occurs. So because I was the subject, as Alan says, of the largest racial profiling that had taken place, I was sensitive to that, and that's why we were so pushing on making sure that racial profiling did not take place.
Now, I'm curious to find out how a young fellow of 10, 11 years old, imprisoned in American prisons during World War II, eventually becomes a mayor of San Jose, a congressman from this district, and the Secretary of Commerce and Transportation. How did that all happen?
First of all, I want to thank all of you for what you do in participation in AREAA. My background is insurance agency. Dad started an agency in 1920. I was in the Korean War and then served in Japan for 2 years and came back in 1956 to San Jose to join my dad, who was primarily life insurance. I did that for 3 years. Then I said to him, Papa, I don't know if I can do this the rest of my life. So I said, let me set up the fire and casualty side of the agency. He said, no, too much paperwork, too much work, not enough commission. Can you think of a year that we didn't go on a summer vacation all through the Depression? So life insurance did that with his family. And I said, no, I'm just not built to do life insurance for the rest of my life. So in 1958, I decided to start looking at fire and casualty and signed up with a number of companies. I signed up also with Safeco Insurance Company. But I never got the return contract back from Safeco for a long time. And this is 6, 7 months, and I'd be going up to Seattle to meet with T.J. Hall, the chairman and CEO of Safeco Insurance Company. I didn't know it, but I was about to become the first non-white insurance agent for Safeco Insurance Company. I guess they wanted to make sure they didn't make a mistake. So I don't know what they did for the 6, 7 months, and finally they sent back the signed contract, and I became the first non-white Safeco insurance agent. But I watch what you folks do. I was at your state California meeting, what was that, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? And your participation, and it is so important because there are decisions being made that impact you directly. The people making those decisions have no idea what the nature of what you're going through. So AREAA is very, very important. Well, we didn't have an Asian American Insurance Agents Association. And so in 1967, we had our first directly elected mayor here in San Jose. And a member of the city council was among those who ran, was elected mayor, and that created a vacancy on the city council. So the new mayor and 2 incumbent members of the city council came to me and said, would you submit your name for consideration by us to fill that appointment, that vacancy by appointment? I said, well, you know, I'm in business with my dad, let me talk to him first. So I talked to my dad. He said, look, you and I can make arrangements on how we're going to split the duties to run the agency. But in Japan, there's an old adage that if you're in politics, you're going to be like the nail sticking out of the board. And you know what happens to that nail all the time? It gets pounded. Can you stand being pounded by your friends and by your colleagues and your neighbors and your constituents? John knows. And so I said, well, it's for a 2-year term. If I don't like it, then I won't run, and I'll just quit. Well, I found out at 2 years that I was enjoying it, so I decided to run for the full 4-year term. At the end of the 2nd year of my 4-year term, the mayor that had been elected decided not to seek re-election. And by that time, I was vice mayor. And so a lot of people said, you've got to run. And there was a very prominent businessman. He came to me one day, he said, Norm, you've got to run. Well, as you know, in local politics here in California, running for city council, for county supervisor, you're not designating party on the ballot. This fellow was the chairman of the Santa Clara County Republican Committee, and he was encouraging me to run for mayor. And he said, and if you say yes, we've got Jim Wiesler, the regional vice president of the Bank of America, who's going to be your finance chairman. So I always said that I ran for mayor using Republican money and Democratic workers, got elected mayor in 1971. In fact, the unemployment was so bad, there were 14 people running for mayor. And that actually helped me out, because I was able to win by over 50% of the votes in the primary. So I didn't have a general election to have to go through. So that was really my introduction to politics. It also came from my father. My father came as a 14-year-old from Japan. He was supposed to be in Salinas to join up with his uncle, and as he said, I didn't know that much about U.S. geography, and I got off the ship in Seattle, So he's 900 miles away from where he should be, 14 years old, doesn't know the language, customs, or anything. So he worked from one lumber camp, forest camp in Seattle, down to Salinas. Took him a year and a half. So by the time he gets to Salinas, he's 16 years old. His uncle says, "You've got to learn English." So he put him in the first grade. And he said it was the most humiliating thing he ever did. Not because he didn't know English, but because he was 5'3". Some of those kids in that school were getting as tall as he was. So he said, makes you want to learn English very quickly. So he decided that by second grade he had enough English and he graduated himself from school. And because he knew English, he was sort of the liaison between the Japanese community and the majority community. And one day he was acting as a court interpreter, and these two people came up to him afterwards and said, "How'd you like to go into the insurance business?" He said, "I know nothing about the insurance business." And they said, "Well, we'll teach you." So he took their cars, but didn't think anything about it. And finally in 1919, he decided to go see them. And in 1920, he started the insurance business. And so for us, it was a good source of income for the family. And he did well. So he was in that kind of a setting where he was a community leader and seeing all this. And then on December 7th, people were coming to the house by the droves, or the phone was ringing about what's going to happen to us now. So all of these things, plus my participation in the Japanese Methodist Church, and then as well as the in the insurance business and being in the community, helped me get into politics.
You know, on a personal note, I also have fire and casualty insurance agency, and I don't think I told Norman the story, or Secretary Mineta the story, but I first met him way back in 1967 or 68. I don't know if you remember, there was a company called the Western Pioneer Insurance Company. Both of us were agents for that company, and they had a luncheon in San Francisco at the old Bianco Hotel. And I was invited, and I saw this young, dark-haired insurance agent from San Jose. They introduced me as Norman Mineta, as I believe you were city councilman at the time. And I said, wow, this guy's really something. He's just a little bit older than I am. But as I said earlier, he's been my hero and role model ever since. Well, you know, I think I have some other questions, but I'm sure that some of you in the audience have some questions for him. So, do we have a microphone for the audience? Why don't you just raise your hand and you have an opportunity to ask.
Let me also point out that Alan's mother and dad were very active in community life in San Francisco. So he, like they say, the fruit doesn't fall far from the trees. So that's why he's so active in terms of, because he's following again in what his parents did through their career.
Secretary Mineta, we're so proud that you're here. And we're so proud that an Asian is represented in the U.S. government. I do have very many questions, but I'm going to ask you only a couple. Other than in 1942, when they put the Japanese in the internment camp, do you remember any other time when you were discriminated as an Asian?
Or two, there were a lot of occasions where people would say things. And you know, the funny thing, remember they had, there were PSA announcements on the radio saying you can tell that Germany Italian or Japanese spy and described some of the things. But when it came to the Japanese spy, the Japanese have a difficulty pronouncing their R's or their L's and their V's. V's sound like D, L sounds like R. So, kids would come up to me and shoot these rhymes at me, and I'd sail through them with the L's and the B's and the R's, and they say, "You sure you're Japanese?" And but I mean, little things. Probably right after I was elected, someone had spray painted on our garage door, JAP, and but it really didn't happen that often in terms of what occurs. Just as a follow-up on the V's and B's. The NHK is the largest TV broadcasting company in Japan, and they sent a crew the week before the election to follow me around. Then they take the film to San Francisco Airport and fly it to Tokyo, and every night I'd be on television in Tokyo. So the day of the election, they were filming me that night at the victory party and sent that all off to Japan. And the next day I get a telegram from my relatives in Japan, and it said, "We saw your smiling face on television. Congratulations on your erection." I always smile when I get on television. Now by Constitution, I'm guaranteed one every 2 years.
Seems like the microphone is not working, but I'll just go ahead and ask you the other question that I have written down. While you were speaking, all these questions arise in my mind. So the next question is, we have so many young people here, and if any of them has a inkling as to run for a public office, what would you advise them?
Well, let me look at my... thing is that in a democratic society, you have everyone from a well-read citizen to a person who seeks political office. This group over here on the right, maybe only 1 or 2% of the population. There's this other 98, 99% of people. And I always maintain that I want people to pursue their professional and career goals. But take maybe 15, 20% of your time and say to the mayor, county executive, the governor, to the president, "I'm a subject matter expert, and I'd like to serve on planning commission, parks and recreation commission, police commission," whatever it is. And people ought to be doing that as they pursue their own career goals. Being in public service doesn't necessarily mean you have to run for public office. There are so many other ways to do that. And it is important that people who look like us are in those places. And when you get to that spot, I don't want you to fade away and run away from your ancestry or your religion or your art or your culture. I want you to bring everything you are to the table so that people know the world is made up of a lot of different people, and we have to acknowledge and honor those differences. I always ask people, like in DC when I ride cabs, predominantly foreign drivers, are you teaching your kids Ethiopian or Nigerian, whatever the language might be? Yeah, but they'd rather be playing marbles, whatever. But I don't think of us as a melting pot. I think of the United States like tapestry, where you have yarns of different colors, and each of those yarns are strong by themselves, representing the art, the religion, culture, whatever it is from wherever your forebears came from. But when they're woven together, they make for a very strong whole. And every 4 years, at the time of the Olympics, I'm really proud. You know what the team from China is going to look like. You know what the team from Japan is going to look like. You know what the team from Norway is going to look like. You know what the team from Germany is going to look like. But when that group comes in from the United States of America, it makes me proud to see people of all sizes, shapes, colors, whatever. And when you think about people like someone here in San Jose, a fellow by the name of Yoshi Uchida, who coached the judo team. And the first one in 1964, and subsequently on a number of other U.S. Olympic judo teams. He is the judo coach here at San Jose State, and they, I think, have won something like 23 years of championships, collegiate championships in the United States. So I don't want you to run away from who you are. Your strength is bringing who you are to the table. And as I said, it doesn't mean you have to run for office. There are other ways to do that. Someone was telling about being on the planning commission. Well, that's what I did with Mike Honda when he came back from the Peace Corps. And he's a teacher. So I said, Mike, I want you to put your name in for planning commission. And we'll have you be interviewed by the personnel committee. And that's where Mike got his start. So it's a good way to participate, but more importantly, you're representing the community when you're there. And there are a lot of ways that you can still pursue your professional goals and yet be part of community service.
Okay, that's a real, I guess the question is about real estate. But, when the Japanese people were taken into internment, there were farm owners and real estate holders and stuff. So what happened to the real estate after the internment, when finally they were released back? Did they get their properties back? I'm curious.
In many instances, they did not. As you know, in Washington, Oregon, and California, there was something called the alien land law. And it's just said that if you're not eligible to become a U.S. citizen, you cannot own land in our state. In 1892, the Chinese Exclusion Act said Chinese could not become citizens. In 1924, the Oriental Exclusion Act said Orientals could not become citizens. Today I say Asian Americans are people, Orientals are runs. So, but the thing is that because the alien land law existed, and people did have, who were not U.S. citizens, had land in their name. But when the evacuation occurred, the state escheated those lands, took them over, and they never went back to the owners who were there. Now, we had an attorney here in San Jose by the name of J.B. Peckham. And if you looked at the property rolls of the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, you'd see J.B. Peckham, J.B. Peckham, J.B. Peckham, all over the place. You go, wow, this guy's really rich. Look at all the stuff he owns. He didn't own it. He held it in his name for the Chinese, the Filipinos, and the Japanese, who were the real owners. My dad bought a piece of lot in 1928 to build a family home. It was in J.B. Peckham's name. And when my oldest sister became 21, Mr. Peckham transferred the land to my oldest sister. So that land was in her name. She's a U.S. citizen, so they couldn't touch lands of that nature that were in the hands of U.S. citizens. So in this case, Mr. Peckham really was able to save a lot of land for those who were otherwise who were excluded from owning land because of the alien land law. And at the time of the evacuation, it really saved people in San Mateo County, Santa Clara County, Monterey, San Benito, a lot, and Santa Cruz counties, a lot of grief.
With your more than half a century's experience working in public office, serving all of us, first of all, I want to thank you. And I want to see what you have observed as the most significant progress in the last 50 years in the Asian American community in terms of holding public offices. And also, going forward, we've been hearing that the Asian population is growing so fast, and we are becoming the majority in this country. But looking at all the public offices, we don't seem to be represented in proportion. What would you say, what would be your word of wisdom for us to really get into the public office spectrum and be represented accordingly?
Next question. You know, that's the very essence of what I think all of us are trying to do. In 1993, I formed the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus within the Congress. Now that was 5 of us at the time. Bob Matsui, Patsy Pink, Dan Inoue, Dan Akaka, and myself. We could have our meeting in a telephone booth. In 2007, Gary Locke, who had stepped down as governor of Washington, and I formed a political action committee called AOF, America's Opportunity Fund. We wanted to fund people and encourage people who were in the pipeline to run for statewide office or federal office. We didn't want to deal with mayor, state legislature. We wanted to deal with statewide office or federal office. And so we started a system of trying to encourage people to look at politics as a profession. And it culminated in 2012 with 17 people running for Congress. 2012. Of the 2012, of the 12, 7 were elected to the House or the Senate. And Macy Hirono to the U.S. Senate as an example. But here in California we have Ami Berra from Sacramento, an MD, Indian American, Mark Chicano from Riverside County. But we just have a lot of these people, and that has increased the number of Asian Pacific Americans in the Congress. We're far short of where we ought to be in terms of percentage of representation. And that's why, Arian, I think that this pipeline concept is important. There are people at the city council level, mayor level, who ought to consider running for state assembly, whatever. And what we're really doing right now is concentrating on statewide and federal office. There's a fellow by the name of William Tong from Connecticut who's going to run for the U.S. Senate in Connecticut. He was the mayor of Providence, I think it was, and we thought he had a good shot at it, but he didn't make it past the primary. But there are people who really ought to be considered, and we ought to be encouraging to run for political office. And hopefully more and more will step up. There are roughly 19 million Asian Pacific Americans now in the United States. Chinese Americans being the largest, Filipino Americans number 2, Vietnamese being number 3, and then after that it drops off because those 3 groups measure in the millions. The next largest is Japanese American, but it's down to 870,000 population in the United States. And there's not too much migration from Japan to the United States. But we're finding more and more local candidates, whether school board, city council, people who are coming. In fact, at one point here in Santa Clara County, for the 15 mayors, 5 were Asian Pacific Americans. 1 was U.S. native born, 4 were immigrants. So, it shows that, again, there's that opportunity that people ought to pursue. One of the funniest ones, or not funny, but one of the most interesting ones I ran across was Falls River, Massachusetts. Here's a Vietnamese person who came here soon after the fall of Vietnam on April 29th of 1975. And he's an engineer by background. He couldn't get a job and started as a custodian in a school district. And he eventually got his credentials in engineering, known to a lot of people, and got a job as an engineer. And then decided to run for school board, Falls River. And he did that for 8 years. He's now on the city council in Fall River, Massachusetts. Here's this immigrant who was a custodian at the school, and now he's on the city council. There are a lot of stories like that that are just tremendous. Should be encouragement to native born Americans to say, I'm going to get off my duff and participate in community service and maybe think about running for public office.
Okay, I think that concludes our